valued colleague and friend that I've known for a quarter of a century. I've learned a great many valuable lessons from Antonio, most recently how to make a really good dry martini. As an architect, urban designer, author, and teacher, Antonio is a sage interpreter of the two worlds in which he has inhabited and continues to contribute professionally and academically, the United States and Italy. He received the Fulbright Fellowship to study and conduct research in the United States on 2 occasions, once in 1984 and again in 1996. He received a Master in Urban Design at Columbia University and also taught in its urban design program. He joined the firm of Cooper Eckstedt during the design and construction of Battery Park City and subsequently authored his book, Battery Park City, based on his intimate knowledge of that groundbreaking project. On the Italian side, he graduated in architecture with a thesis in urban planning at the prestigious Sapienza in Rome, where he contributes to teach a studio in urbanism for the European Master in Architecture program. Beside Battery Park City, he has authored several books, including a trilogy on urban design called La Progettazione Urbana. He practices in Rome and has many international urban projects to his credit. He is a full member of the Italian Istituto Nazionale di Urbanistica. And one of my favorite projects that Antonio has undertaken, and I'm not sure if he'll be talking about this evening or not, is a plan to conduct a series of interventions from Canterbury, England to Rome to recast and retrace the Pilgrim's route. We're going to try to enlist Antonio to do the same for Lewis and Clark, especially the underwater part, as it exists. But I'm sure we'll have a solution for that. So let me welcome Antonio Latini, who will be talking tonight about an axiological system for urban design. Thank you.
Good evening. I am very grateful to Professor Jim Tice, to the Department of Architecture, and to all of you, scholars and students, for the opportunity to be here tonight, 15 years after my first visit to the University of Oregon. It's a great honor and it's a pleasure. The reason of my gratitude to Jim goes beyond the invitation to speak today to such a prestigious academic setting. His encouragement, his advice have meant a great deal in the clarification of many of the ideas that I will share with you tonight. To begin, I have 2 reasons to apologize. The first one has to do with my declining command of the English language, which I tested in the last few days. And I don't mean my funny accent. So to avoid that, to keep you waiting while I peruse my memory searching for words that I would never find, I decided to read my presentation. The second apology has to do with the topic of my presentation. Jim had suggested that I speak about the present situation of the discipline in Italy. I will not fulfill that task. In fact, quite the opposite. I will try to speak about what is not going on in Italy today, or at least what is not going on with the same frequency and intensity I would like and expect. Finally, I prepared my notes thinking of students. So I'm afraid some of you will find my reasoning overly didactic, and I apologize for that too. A few years ago, a trilogy of books that I edited together with Paolo Colarossi, that Jim has mentioned before, entitled La Progettazione Urbana, which roughly translates into urban design, was published. During the very last period of preparation of the books, I found myself having to cover a subject that none of the authors had included in his contribution. That is the compilation of the vicissitudes relating to the various declensions of urban design in the last several decades, 60, 70 years. That is, after the last important contribution to the disciplinary debate. The result of that effort is included in the first of the three books, and it's certainly not the product of a historian. Rather, it is an attempt to start synthesizing and ordering materials aimed at enhancing a designer's control on the disciplinary praxis. While collecting and comparing ideas, events, and projects, I started realizing that an axiological system began to take form. I mean, a set of values or principles connected by progressive correlations, or forms of synergy by which, in most instances, efforts toward one would reinforce the others. This system of values seems to be a good base for virtuous design, and I realize that I myself have referred to it while designing, although in an unsystematic way, during the last decades. In fact, for a long time, I looked at this legacy as if it were a stable asset of the discipline, free from the conditioning of cultural fashion. Recently, however, the evidence is growing, in Italy at least, that projects that customarily have been treated by urban design not only disregard that system, but they also enable or not interested in producing, formulating, or adopting an alternative system. The feeble logic shown by the design process, and most importantly, the poor quality of the results of most of the local area design projects in my country, many since the early 90s, suggest that it is time for reconsideration, regardless of how reactionary this may appear. Before treating the 7 principles of urban design as I have named them, I need to give some background as to their origin and ambits of elaboration. It seems that the axiological system I will propose is mainly, but not only, the product of a reaction against the modern movement, its ideas, its disciplinary logic, its agenda, or I should say, against what had become the strongest and most pervasive image of the modern movement. These principles, the way I see them, grew out of a critique of the modern movement's disregard for the quality of urban space, its lack of interest for historical continuity, for the ineptitude of the functional city to function in satisfying the fundamental needs of man due to its simplistic mechanical approach. There is not enough time here to elaborate that, in my opinion, those efforts critical of the modern movement, rather than act as a counter-reform, would play as a modern reform towards a more open, humanistic, inclusive project of modernity. There are three interconnected and converging circumstances emerging as supporting what may be too much to consider as an epistemological break with modernism. One derives from a notion of anthropological constants that is well synthesized in the words used by Aldo van Eyck in his speech at the 1959 CM in Otterlo. A man is always and everywhere essentially the same. The second is the increasing lack of faith in the possibility of positively solving design problems with a programmatic bias by invention, and the resurgence of a paradigmatic attitude by evolution, together with a revival of typological studies, examples of which are some essays by Giulio Carlo Argan, and then Alain Colhan, and later on Tony Vidler. To be fair, at an urban scale, the contribution of the systems approach is still valid and for more than one good reason. But here, the question is whether the quantitative analysis and the process of finding fit solutions part by part of a complex system can be applied to an incrementally reformed city or cannot but produce a habitat never seen before. Finally, there is a renewed interest in the historical city as an object of values to be preserved, and more in general, for the existing city, the true, the out there, the non-pedigree, the situation city. One of the clues of this renewal is the fruitful studies in urban history and in popular architecture and in historic centers, especially during the 50s and the 60s. The assumption to draw from these three inclinations make the city as it is, with its virtues and its shortcomings, a very good reference, a model in fact in the successful cases for urban design. Rather than the machine and the biological organisms as models, the city itself becomes a viable paradigm for envisioning the city. This new attitude consolidates during the proceedings of the last CMs and with studies and projects all over the world during the first decades after World War II. In at least 4 cases, the disciplinary production takes the form of a proper school. Significant elaborations happen in the US, in Italy, but also in the UK. Cultural crossovers between the US and Italy have taken so many forms that it is impossible to even synthesize them at this time. Though it may be of some interest here to mention that some time ago I found a list of qualities common to certain ways of interpreting urbanism in the US and in Italy during the first half of the 20th century that seemed to show a high concordance with the axiological system under discussion. I found them first in an essay by Gwen Wright, referring to urbanism in the US in the period between the two world wars, and immediately after in the description of Italian urbanism in the same period, especially in Rome, with Gustavo Giovannoni and Marcello Piacentini. I list these qualities quoting from Wright. The idea of buildings not as isolated objects, but as part of cohesive communities. The use of vernacular diction that drew more from local history and ordinary speech than from abstract rhetoric. The choice to adapt each design to its particular context, social, historical, architectural, and environmental. The use of active collaboration, the opposite of the myth of individual genius. The preference for an intentional variety in massing, roof lines, or detailing to counteract the threat of tedium and conformity. A major consideration in housing design, as with public setting, that involved the open space around dwellings. I need to say that here I used Gwen Wright's words, but the selection and interpretation of my responsibility. These ideas that are not universally present but all very well represented in the US and in Italy are integrated, debated, and scientifically elaborated, though with very different attitudes and results, during the following decades. I will briefly list the 4 schools that I've mentioned, roughly in chronological order, even though at least 3 of them may be considered contemporaneous. The first one, in Italy, bridges Rome and Venice with their architecture schools, with many faculty moving from one to the other. Saverio Muratori, whose Studi per una operante storia urbana di Venezia was published in 1959, Aldo Rossi, L'architettura della città was out in 1966, Carlo Aimonino, Vittorio Gregotti are among the most well-known scholars. The studies on the relation between building typologies and urban morphology and on the articulation between primary elements and urban fabric are among the most important contributions to urban design theory and practice. In America, this is the time of Jane Jacobs, of the social planners of the University of Pennsylvania School, of Bernard Rudowski's Anonymous Architecture, of books like Cities by Alfrin and Design of Cities by Bacon. But it is around Kevin Lynch in Boston that the production takes the form of a proper school. When I was a student in Italy, the only book on urban design truly accessible was The Image of the City, published in 1960. It was highly appreciated, even though, as we can recognize today, its contribution was actually limited to the cognitive, recognition, and orientation ambit. The English contribution was important too. A creative group formed around the magazine Architectural Review with people like Jan Nairn, J.M. Richards, Ivor de Wolf, and of course Gordon Cullen, the author of the universally known Townscape published in 1961. The object of interest and study of all these groups and people was the existing city, though in very different manifestations. The historic city, the picturesque English village, the American metropolis, and so on. Slightly following the three moments that I have mentioned is the work of Colin Rowe's School of Urban Design at Cornell, starting in 1963. Here, the search for a radical middle of the road between tradition and modern, between the city of spaces and the city of solids, between regular and irregular, takes the form of an erudite system good as a reference base for a wide range of urban compositions. Here too, urbanism is the art of relationship, and in fact, contextualism is one of the key words adopted by the studios at Cornell and explored by Rowe and its disciples in many essays. So, it is my reading that this is the period and these are the conditions under which the axiological system started consolidating. As we shall see, I selected 7 keywords related to these values, but I acknowledge that this is an abstraction, of course. They might be 5 or 6 or 10 as well, since each one could be subdivided or aggregated with others. The quantity here may just mean that I like the number 7. The concept of place is probably the most well known and debated. It is the most controversial as well. Since the early post-World War II years, there was a growing awareness that, quoting Rosenberg, the life of urban men was becoming more anonymous and mobile, or in architectural terms, there was an inexorable movement from symbolically rich systems to impoverished ones, from cultural roles to functional ones, or just simply from place to space. This had led many designers to attempt to reestablish the basis for urban identity, the feeling that you are somebody living somewhere, as Peter Smithson phrased it. In the meantime, theoretical achievements by philosophers such as Martin Heidegger, whose conference Building Dwelling Thinking in 1951 is probably the most famous, helped replace the Enlightenment category of limitless space, spatium in extensio, with the more archaic notion of realm or place, as Kenneth Frampton has subsequently pointed out. As Aldo van Eyck, again, was to word it in 1959 in the Team 10 primer, whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more. For space in the image of man is place, and time in the image of man is occasion. Now, considering that place is an essential element of human habitat, and therefore is also an essential element in the design of the environment for human beings, leads us to 2 conclusions. First of all, it is a claim for urban compositions made out of elements loaded with identity and meaning, under known or shared codes with complexity and richness. Second, it implies the recognition of a structural function for open space, the void with the quality of a figure in the figure-ground interplay within the urban fabric. I have borrowed my second keyword, figura, a Latin term, from Françoise Choet's La règle et le modèle, when she quotes Thomas More. Translation is mine. So, Utopus has conveyed to Utopia inhabitants the whole plan of the city. Totam anc urbis figuram. He has not left but secondary, inessential, epiphenomenic tasks to the following generations: the facade, decoration, the improvement of well-being, for which he didn't have time left. If we simplify this concept, we may arrive at Daniel H. Burnham's statement: a city plan must ever deal mainly with the direction and width of its streets. Or to what Cooper Exted said about Battery Park City, the street map, more than any other tool, establishes the quality, character, and type of urban environment to be built in Battery Park City. In other words, designing by places leads to the search for awareness in their interrelationships. If the concept of place represents a new attention for the semantics of the urban landscape's basic elements, by analogy, the concept of figura alludes to the necessity for a deliberate syntax of those elements as the essential prerequisites against both the disorienting and inhospitable city. However, it is not at all an issue of style, since both prevalent space and prevalent volume systems may work. Rather, it's a question of the ability to produce non-accidental and recognizable, open to different levels of cognition and fruition wholes, in their function as the primary generators of structure. Patterns such as these are made of both a narrative continuity of spaces and combinations of volumes, of interaction and alternate prevalence of solid and void, of a composed presence of coherent phenomenological systems, including objects and activities. If we interpret the city and the region through the key of syntax, the importance assigned to the context assumes multiple dimensions. Context means attention to the environmental and functional congruence of the project with its natural and social milieu, as well as with its economic and administrative underpinnings, with their relevance to its feasibility. But context is also continuity and integration with its physical surroundings, be they urban fabric or landscape, in terms of recognizing significant relations, not necessarily in the sense of simply replicating settlement patterns. And context is understanding of the conventional apparata of cultural geography and balance insertion in the local tradition with neither acquiescence and subjection nor arrogant personalism and carelessness. Finally, at the scale of formal elements, context is consideration for the congenitas, that is, the harmony among different components within the immediate morphological frame. In the words of Louis Kahn, the street is a room by agreement, a community room, the walls of which belong to the donors, dedicated to the city for common use. Therefore, adopting the criterion of context means to design with the awareness of contributing to a larger whole, though through a limited control of just one component. This is because each part is an element per se, as well as a part of a superior entity, a twin phenomenon, as Van Eyck would name it. It is evident that this implies, on one hand, a wider responsibility for each design, and on the other, the need for a concerted analytical effort on many levels, requiring a great deal of time and resources. I should add, this is quite unusual in the fast modalities, design modalities that are rather common in Italy today. After Giovannoni, Muratori, and Rossi, the Italian culture of the architecture of the city has contributed significantly to the understanding of the structure of urban landscape and of the recurring associations among its different components. The relationship between urban morphology and building typologies, the correspondence between building types and density, and most simply, the dialectics among primary elements of urban fabric are the basis for the virtuous composition of the elements of the urban scene. They are also essential references for a structured interplay among their different roles on the one hand, and on the other, their syntactic position and their configuration. Today, the discipline doesn't seem to be able to build a sufficient intellectual frame for itself, and the individual competence is not always adequate. In addition, the lack of awareness of institutional clients about the variegated roles of urban elements profoundly impacts our world of building design. In fact, until roughly 150 years ago, the designer would almost exclusively deal with monuments. It seems that this convention still has consequences for the designer's education and influences her his weaknesses or unwillingness to design background buildings and her his acceptance of the differences between the two. In the disciplinary debate, the question of number in urbanism has always been crucial, and for various reasons. It implies the search and therefore the possibility to evaluate a suitable balance between unity and multiplicity. It is a controversial subject because it issues from philosophy and aesthetics and affects economics and governance, fields in which their structural relevance is more widely accepted. Many are the positions on this topic. Some emphasize the goal of stylistic coherence in the wake of Descartes. Il n'y a pas tant de perfection dans les ouvrages composés de plusieurs pièces et faits de la main de divers maîtres qu'en ceux auxquels un seul a travaillé. This offers a strong rationale to back architectural designs of entire neighborhoods entrusted to one archistar or to the technical office of one developer. When one looks at the result of this approach, however, especially the most recent ones, they are rather upsetting, boring, or arrogant. Decades of urban design have shown the aesthetic virtue of composed variety, in a line with the idea expressed by Marc-Antoine Loger of dessiner le plan d'une ville de manière que la magnificence du total se subdivise en une infinité de beautés de détails tout différentes, qu'on n'y rencontre presque jamais le même objet, qu'en la parcourant du bout à l'autre, on trouve dans chaque quartier quelque chose de neuf, de singulier, de saisissant. Fascinating. It is a city where the urbs is the reflection of the civitas. Pro hominum varietate, according to the variety of men, to phrase it after Leon Battista Alberti. But it is also a city that is able to pursue its tradition of richness, while fostering the participation of a larger set of actors and allowing for gradual implementation. But the plural must find its balance in the singular. Sometimes the ideal expressed by Leibniz, diversitas identitate compensata, diversity balanced by identity, entrusts equilibrium between variety and coherence to the authority of a head group or to the ruling power of a sketch. More frequently, in the best practices, it relies upon an essential tool in the process of incremental definition of the design decisions, a system of rules, codes, of guidelines. They allow for designing cities without designing buildings, as Jonathan Burnett has said, and control the overall quality of the whole. From the point of view of aesthetics, rules anticipate the context and represent roles when there is not yet a surrounding fabric, or more generally, when there may not be the ability to interpret the context. Rules help the implementation of subsequent phases to remain coherent, but they find the relevance also in the economic realm, because they shelter investments from future uncertainties and are an efficient prerequisite for rapid authorization procedures. Finally, from a methodological perspective, the need to declare priorities in a non-ambiguous language and following a non-arbitrary rationale forces designers to clarify what is key in their schemes and what is not. Rules are, in the end, the true key tool for a virtuous participation, for the shaping of a city that is a community project, in equilibrium between monotony and anarchy. Finally, its anthropocentric attitude is one of the distinctive qualities of urban design. It also seems to be one of the features that differentiates it from the autonomist, self-referenced stream of building design. according to the way architecture has been often envisioned by the disciplinary discourse during the last decades. It is mainly this attitude that registers, though often unconsciously, urban design in that project of modernity that had been a banner of the 20th century. So, the spaces of the city are imagined, and new and regenerated districts are designed, in fact, as an expression of the community. Most importantly, they should be made to the measure of men. Following this principle, the city multiplies into parts, each with its own character, and elements of a city, each with its functional and formal dignity. Pursuing this idea further, the quantitative issues of the availability of services, of social structure, the balanced and accessible distribution of common uses, of those civic structures that serve and represent the community, is not a trivial matter. These subjects do not exclude, but in fact reinforce one another, each according to its own capacity, the crucial one being the structure of the city's image made of identity places. So here are 7 principles by which I have tried to represent the axiological system that has emerged by reading through some of the main achievements of urban design. These principles are a product of the cross-fertilization that took place in different moments of the 20th century, of which American and Italian cultures were protagonists. I have already said that I do not consider the 7 principles the only way of representing that system, even less the best way to represent it. I should add 2 further considerations. The first is that these are not the only components of a system of values for urban design for the immediate future, as I see it. More values should be included, among which sustainability, participation, efficiency, widened opportunity, openness to incremental implementation. But the latter do not exclude the former. Actually, I feel that newly recognized values would in fact reinforce the whole system. The second and final consideration, it goes without saying, is that I don't think about the 7 values I've mentioned as the 7 commandments. They are, in my mind, more a source of inspiration for design and a good interpretive tool, and possibly a useful base for future discussion. Thank you.
Would you be willing to entertain questions?
Of course. I don't know if I know how to answer, but
Antonio, I have a question, and it's kind of connected to your to be continued, which is, you just talked about Italy and America as being protagonists in developing scenarios for urban planning, urban design. In the 20th century, what are you imagining in the 21st century as we look to places like Shanghai and beyond, you know, if we look at Malaysia, we look at all over the world, what new practices are out there, and are these principles, how do they hold, and how do you...
Applicable.
Yeah.
Okay, I said that I could take questions, but I don't know. I can't guarantee answers. Well, it's a difficult question, in fact. And I asked myself this question several times. Somehow I feel that there are these principles refer to, as I said before, as I mentioned, to some anthropological constants, which means that I'm not really subject to the succession of modes of fashion. But from that to say that they apply to, say, an Eastern cultures as the same way they apply to a Western country, I don't know. But I registered the fact that the developments that I see, not because I went there, but because they are very much published in our magazines, they look very much similar to the developments in our countries, aren't they? Even though the rapidity of the transformation is completely new. So I think that this will depend on the structural situation of the structural base of economy, of demography in the next decades, and that I don't know. I would say I'm a planner, not a magician. So I really don't know.
Well, we don't know either. So it's not a question where there's an answer. I think this is a really unfolded, really, this issue of time, which you addressed sort of, you know, in some way, how does it affect the operations of these other principles?
I think in this sense, I think these are good tools. Mm-hmm. If I think about rules, right? When the transformation happens with time, a designer has the time to see what happened before. But once a designer has to operate without knowing what's going on and will be there in a few months, but it's still not there, that's difficult. And for instance, in this case, rules help because they offer a frame to which everybody can refer. Also, I think, I repeat that, it's a good way of confronting and participating because on the rules, you know, a larger set of people can help on one hand. The other, real estate investors feel more comfortable because they know they have a sort of guarantee. They know that their investment is not going to be lost just because they don't know what will happen in front of the building they're building. And since it's, at this point it's quite accepted, the fact that one of the major elements to that give value to a building is what is outside the building. That is, it becomes very relevant. So in a sense, I think more and more there should be a public control to transformation, which doesn't mean strict planning. It means a frame within which then there is freedom to operate. But this is the common situation for liberal democracies. And that's probably why in these ambits, liberal democracies are much further than any other. In my opinion, they work rather well, if I make a comparison. Did I answer the question? No.
Well, you know, it comes up over and over. I'm not sure there's, I think you did answer the question, and the notion of rules is an interesting one.
then, for instance, if you think about measure, I know that in different cultures there are different references. But then I think that the constants are prevalent on the differences in a way, which in my mind means that when we operate in different contexts, cultural contexts, on one hand we have to keep in mind what we know about human beings. Think about it. We are more or less the same height, shaped more or less the same way. Of course, there are differences. So when we operate in different contexts, we have to take, within the project, the difference. We have to be aware of them and be aware of how much the differences project on the design. And if I had to add, I would be, how can I say, I would be careful not to disregard the differences, but also careful not to emphasize differences that are maybe not so relevant to the object of design, the result of the design. But we all know it's not an easy business. So,
Antonio, I would like to ask you a question. Since it's in the neighborhood of Battery Park City, and that's the World Trade Center ground zero, there's been, of course, a lot of discussion 10 years plus now since 9/11 that the wheels are still turning to develop that part of Manhattan into somehow an integrated whole that, of course, recognizes the tragic event that took place there. Do you have any comments about the urban design, just that urban design layer that is operating there now as you see it from an Italian perspective?
well, first of all, I have to say that there were so many passages that I don't know all of them. So maybe the idea that I share with you is not completely appropriate. I don't know. You will tell me. But my feeling is that New York as a city, it is so strong that on one hand is able to lead a design, and on the other hand, where a design is not, resists to be led by the genius loci, can somehow be little by little with time included, molded, and so on. So, in other terms, I'm optimistic about it, even though just to make it, I'm not particularly fond of the design the way it's being carried on. There were, for instance, there was the scheme. Now I can judge the scheme by Patterson-Littenberg sounded much more inserted in the context. In a way, again, a project like that has such a symbolic meaning that the right balance between the pledge to the zeitgeist and the pledge to the place is a difficult matter. Then each one of us has preferences. And probably I feel more at ease with projects that try to insert themselves in the place with, in their context, rather than show the moment in which they are thought or built. And this is because I can't really. It's kind of sad if something is. It becomes immediately old. I mean, the year after, it was a project of last year or 2 years ago. And it's like, I know the cars in this country are changed year by year so that one can show that it's a car that is brand new. For buildings, it's difficult to do that, even though the replacement frequency here is it's much faster than in my country, though they should last more. So, which doesn't mean, of course, just to make it clear, that new buildings have to look like old buildings, so they don't have to take in account the advancement of technology, the new need, and so on. Rather, that probably technology should be a tool and not, what can I say, an aesthetic preference. Well, the answer is banal enough, but
No, I appreciate that. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much, Antonio.
thank you.